Long before Iran became a threat, it was anointed. Picture this. Over 2,000 years ago, in the dusty chambers of ancient Babylon, a Hebrew prophet named Isaiah penned words that would echo through eternity. He wrote the name of a king who hadn't even been born yet, a Persian ruler named Cyrus, and he called him God's anointed. What if I told you that every headline screaming about Iran today, every missile threat, every nuclear negotiation, every alliance forged in the shadows, was already written in the scroll of prophecy? What if the name Iran was never just political, but prophetic? Tonight, we're pulling back the veil on one of the most chilling revelations hidden in plain sight. The ancient land of Persia, modern-day Iran, doesn't just appear in your Bible. It's woven into the very fabric of God's end-times blueprint. From the book of Daniel to the visions of Ezekiel, Iran's destiny has been mapped out with terrifying precision. But here's what will shake you to your core. The same nation that God once used to deliver Israel from captivity is the very nation prophesied to lead a final assault against her in the last days. The deliverer becomes the destroyer. The anointed becomes the adversary. Are we watching ancient prophecy unfold in real time? When Iranian leaders declare death to Israel on international television, are they unknowingly reading from a script written by Ezekiel 2,500 years ago? When alliances form between Russia, Turkey, and Iran, the exact coalition described in Ezekiel 38, is this mere geopolitics or divine choreography? And thank you to every single one of you who has supported this message through super thanks. Your generosity means more than you know. You're not just donating. You're helping spread light to others who feel alone in their calling. Whether you give or not, I'm deeply grateful for your presence here, your support, your time, your attention. It all matters. And if this message resonates with your soul, go ahead and plant that seed of faith. Tonight, we're going deeper than headlines. Deeper than politics. We're diving into the spiritual realm, where earthly kingdoms are merely shadows of heavenly purposes. Because if God has already decided this war's end, and the evidence suggests he has, then what you're about to discover will change how you see every news report, every conflict, every tremor in the Middle East. The question that will haunt you until the very end. If Iran's role was written in prophecy long before the Islamic Revolution, long before nuclear weapons, long before modern Israel even existed, then what else has already been decided that we're just now beginning to see? The scroll is unrolling, the stage is set, and you're watching prophecy breathe. Before Cyrus ever breathed, heaven had already spoken his name. In the beginning, when the waters of judgment receded and Noah's ark found rest upon Ararat, 3 sons emerged to populate a broken world: Shem, Ham, and Japheth. From Japheth's loins would come 2 names that would echo through eternity: Madai and Elam. Genesis chapter 10 doesn't just list genealogies, it maps destinies. Madai, father of the Medes. Elam, ancestor of the Persians. 2 bloodlines that would merge into one empire, one force, one instrument in the hands of the Almighty. But this was no accident of history. This was architecture of the divine. Picture the dusty chambers of ancient scribes, their trembling hands recording not mere family trees, but the blueprint of God's unfolding drama. They wrote of Madai without knowing his descendants would one day topple Babylon. They inscribed Elam's name without seeing the Persian crown that would grace his lineage. They were writing prophecy, disguised as genealogy. What if I told you that Iran's story begins not with oil or ayatollahs, but with the whisper of God speaking purpose into bloodlines? That every headline screaming about Iranian threats today was already outlined in the tent of Noah 4,000 years ago? Fast forward through the corridors of time to a moment that defies comprehension. The year is approximately 700 BC. In Jerusalem, A prophet named Isaiah takes up his scroll. Under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, he writes words that would shatter every understanding of how God works. Thus saith the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have holden. Isaiah 45:1. Cyrus. A name written in Hebrew ink over a century before the man would draw his first breath. A Persian king called anointed the same word used for Israel's sacred kings and priests before he ever heard of Israel, before he ever knew the God of Abraham. Can you fathom the magnitude of this moment? The God of Israel, through his prophet, reaches across time itself to name a foreign ruler as his chosen vessel, not chosen for conquest, but for compassion. Not anointed for destruction, but for deliverance. When Cyrus finally rose to power in 539 BC, when his armies swept through Babylon like wind through wheat, he unknowingly fulfilled every syllable of Isaiah's ancient prophecy. His decree to rebuild Jerusalem's temple wasn't political calculation, it was divine dictation. Ezra 1-2 records his words. The Lord God of heaven hath given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he hath charged me to build him an house at Jerusalem. A pagan king, acknowledging Israel's God, a Persian ruler funding Jewish worship, the destroyer becoming the deliverer. But perhaps the most chilling truth is this. If God could write Cyrus into the scrolls of prophecy 150 years before his birth, what else has already been written? What other names has heaven spoken that earth hasn't yet heard? What if your purpose was declared in divine chambers before the world ever wrote your name? Persia was chosen, appointed, anointed, not for her own glory, but for God's fremen, not to build her own kingdom, but to rebuild his. The same empire that would later threaten Israel was once the key to her restoration. But the hand that opened Israel's prison would soon cast a shadow over her peace. He wore no priestly robes, yet the heavens called him my shepherd. In the royal chambers of ancient Persia, a king named Cyrus awakened each morning, unaware that his name had been whispered in the courts of heaven over a century before his birth. Picture the prophet Isaiah, his weathered hands trembling as he penned words that would shatter every religious assumption. Thus saith the Lord, to his anointed, to Cyrus. Anointed, that sacred word reserved for David, for Solomon, for the kings of Israel. Yet here it flows from divine lips onto the scroll, marking a pagan ruler as God's chosen instrument. Can you imagine the shock, the scandal? A Gentile king bearing the title that belonged to the bloodline of Abraham? But God's ways are not our ways. While the children of Israel wept by the rivers of Babylon, while their harps hung silent on the willow trees, while their enemies taunted them, saying, "Sing us one of the songs of Zion," the Almighty was already orchestrating their deliverance through the most unlikely vessel. Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon in a single night. The mighty empire that had carried God's people into captivity crumbled like dust before the Persian storm. But what happened next defied every expectation, every precedent, every human calculation. The conqueror became the liberator. Standing before his court, Cyrus issued a decree that echoes through eternity. The Lord God of heaven hath given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he hath charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem. Listen to those words again. A Persian king acknowledging the God of Israel. A foreign ruler commanding the rebuilding of the very temple his predecessor had destroyed. Ezra records the moment with stunning simplicity. In the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus. God didn't convert Cyrus, he stirred him. Like a master conductor raising his baton, the Almighty moved upon the heart of a pagan king to fulfill promises made to his covenant people. 42,360 exiles began their journey home. They carried with them the sacred vessels of the temple, vessels that Nebuchadnezzar had plundered. now restored by the hand that once seemed their enemy. The gold, the silver, the precious instruments of worship, all flowing back to Jerusalem through Persian generosity. But this was more than political mercy. This was prophetic theater. God was demonstrating that he can write his signature on any heart, move any throne, turn any empire into his instrument. The same hand that scattered his people in judgment was now the hand that restored them in mercy. What about you? Have you ever felt abandoned in your own Babylon? Have you ever wondered if the very circumstances that brought you pain might somehow be part of a larger plan? Could the hand that once scattered you also be the hand that restores you? Cyrus died never fully understanding the eternal weight of his actions. He simply felt compelled to rebuild a temple to a God he barely knew. Yet through his unconscious obedience, the stage was set for the coming of the Messiah. Without Persian mercy, there would have been no temple. Without the temple, no context for the Christ child's dedication. Without restoration, no nation to receive their king. The anointed stranger had fulfilled his purpose. God had turned a foreign throne into his altar. But prophecy never paints in only one color. Persia would not always be the redeemer. In a palace built for pride, a Jewish queen was hidden like a flame behind curtains. Picture the scene. The most powerful empire on earth, stretching from India to Ethiopia, ruled by a king whose word was absolute law. And in the heart of this pagan stronghold, God had quietly positioned a young Hebrew woman named Esther. She didn't seek the crown. She didn't campaign for influence. She was simply placed. But what if I told you that this wasn't just a beautiful story of courage? What if the book of Esther is actually a prophetic mirror, reflecting the eternal spiritual war between the seed of Abraham and the ancient spirit of genocide that still prowls the earth today? The enemy had a name then, Haman, a descendant of the Amalekites, those ancient adversaries of Israel whom God had marked for complete destruction. But Haman wasn't just a man with a grudge. He was a vessel carrying an ancient hatred, a spiritual poison that had been coursing through history since the garden. His plan was breathtakingly simple: total annihilation. Every Jew in the empire, from children to elders, marked for death on a single day. Sound familiar? Today, when Iranian leaders stand before microphones and declare their intention to wipe Israel off the map, they're not creating new hatred. They're channeling something ancient. The same demonic spirit that whispered in Haman's ear is still whispering today, still plotting, still scheming for that final solution. But here's where the story takes a divine turn. In the very palace where death was decreed, salvation was hidden. Esther had been positioned not by political maneuvering, but by providence. When Mordecai sent word of Haman's genocidal plot, his words carried the weight of eternity. Who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? For such a time as this. 4 words that shatter the illusion of coincidence. Esther's royal position wasn't about her beauty or her fortune. It was about God's timing. She was a hidden weapon, placed precisely where she needed to be when evil revealed its hand. And what happened next should send chills down every spine that beats with faith. The very gallows that Haman built for Mordecai became his own place of execution. The decree of death was reversed. The day marked for mourning became a festival of deliverance. Evil's moment of triumph collapsed into divine justice. This is the pattern, beloved. This is how the God of Israel works. He positions his vessels in the halls of power, often in secret, often unrecognized, until the moment when darkness overplays its hand. Then the hidden become the heroes. The silent become the saviors. Are you beginning to see it? When you watch modern Iran funding terror groups, building nuclear weapons, forming alliances with Russia and Turkey, the very nations named in Ezekiel's prophecy, remember Esther. Remember that God has always known how to turn Persia's own plans against itself. What if your silence in the palace was meant to break a nation's death sentence? What if your position, your influence, your voice was placed where it is not by accident, but for such a time as this? The gallows of the past still cast their shadow into the future, and Persia's role was not yet finished. The messenger came late, not because he was weak, but because he was resisted. Picture Daniel, aged and weathered, kneeling by the Tigris River, 21 days of fasting, 21 days of prayer, 21 days of silence from heaven. And then a figure appears, blazing like lightning, voice like thunder, face like the sun. But listen carefully to what this celestial being reveals. "I was delayed," he says, "by the prince of the kingdom of Persia." Not a human prince, not Cyrus or Darius. The prince of Persia, a spiritual principality, a demonic power ruling over an empire from the unseen realm. In that moment, Daniel glimpsed something the world still refuses to see. Behind every throne on earth stands a throne in darkness. Behind every king's crown lies a principality's influence. Behind every empire's rise beats the heart of an ancient war that began before time itself. The angel continued, "The prince of Persia withstood me 21 days, but Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me." Think about that. Heaven's messenger, powerful enough to shut lions' mouths and walk through fire, required backup to break through Persia's spiritual defenses. What kind of darkness had taken hold over that land? What ancient hatred had wrapped itself around the heart of the Persian Empire, like chains around a captive's wrists? This wasn't geopolitics. This was throne room warfare. While Cyrus sat on his earthly throne, believing his own power had conquered Babylon, a darker prince whispered in the shadows, pulling strings that stretched across realms both seen and unseen. But here's what will chill you to the bone. That prince of Persia didn't die when the empire fell. Principalities don't abdicate when governments change. They don't pack up and leave when borders shift or flags are replaced. They linger. They adapt. They find new vessels, new voices, new ways to manifest their ancient hatred. Could it be that the same spiritual force that once withstood Gabriel's message to Daniel is the same darkness that fuels Iran's modern hatred toward Israel? When Iran's leaders stand before microphones declaring death to Israel, are they speaking their own words? Or are they mouthpieces for a principality that has despised God's chosen people for millennia? You see, we watch the news and see missiles and politics. We see nuclear negotiations and proxy wars. But Daniel saw deeper. He saw the real battlefield not in bunkers or war rooms, but in heavenly places where principalities and powers wage war over the destiny of nations. The Apostle Paul understood this. "We wrestle not against flesh and blood," he warned, "but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world." Every conflict between Iran and Israel that makes headlines is merely the shadow cast by a spiritual war that rages in realms our eyes cannot see. Are you battling flesh when your true enemy wears no skin? This is why prayer matters more than politics. This is why the Word of God cuts deeper than any sword forged by man. Because while the world fights with weapons of war, the people of God fight with weapons not of this world, mighty through God to the pulling down of strongholds. The prince of Persia still stands. But greater is he that is in you than he that is in the world. And when prophecy saw Persia again, it was not as a liberator, but as a sword. The ink of Ezekiel 38 was dry long before the first rocket flew. Picture this. Somewhere around 593 BC, in the shadow of Babylonian exile, the prophet Ezekiel received a vision so terrifying, so precise, that it would make generals tremble and nations take notice 26 centuries later. He saw armies descending like a storm cloud. He saw alliances that defied logic. And he saw names, ancient names that would one day march under modern flags. Among those names, written in divine ink, was Persia. Not as a footnote, not as a minor player. Persia stands center stage in the greatest military drama ever prophesied. Persia, Ethiopia, and Libya with them. Ezekiel declares in chapter 38, verse 5, all of them with shield and helmet. This wasn't political commentary. This was heaven's intelligence report, filed before the war even began. But who leads this coalition of the condemned? The prophet calls him Gog, the prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal, ancient names that scholars now trace to the lands we call Russia. Magog, the northern bear, awakening from its slumber to march southward with an appetite for conquest. Can you see it forming? Russia and Iran, two nations whose modern alliance would have seemed impossible just decades ago, yet here they stand, exactly as Ezekiel foretold. Add Turkey, ancient Togarmah, from the uttermost north. Add Libya, the land of Put. Add Sudan, the children of Cush. The coalition is not random. It is prophetic architecture, built brick by brick according to heaven's blueprint. What draws them together? Ezekiel tells us their motive with chilling clarity: to take a spoil and to take a prey. They come not for ideology or territory, but for plunder. They see Israel, a land reborn from the ashes, prosperous beyond measure, dwelling safely in unwalled villages, and their hearts burn with covetousness. But here's what will shake you. This is not merely about earthly armies. Behind every banner, every missile, every marching boot, there pulses a spiritual war older than civilization itself. The same ancient hatred that whispered to Cain, that hardened Pharaoh's heart, that possessed Haman, it now breathes through the rhetoric of modern Iran. When their leaders scream death to Israel, they are not just making political statements. They are channeling the voice of an age-old adversary who knows his time is short. Iran's current alliances are not accidents of diplomacy. They are appointments with destiny. Every weapons shipment to Hezbollah, every proxy war in Syria, every nuclear centrifuge spinning in underground facilities, it's all movement toward a moment that was scripted before the world was young. And yet, Ezekiel doesn't leave us in suspense. He shows us the end of the story before it begins. When this coalition descends like a cloud to cover the land, when they think victory is within their grasp, heaven responds. "My fury shall come up in my face," declares the Lord. Fire rains from the sky. The earth convulses. Confusion overtakes the armies, and they turn their weapons on each other in supernatural chaos. This is not military strategy defeating Iran and her allies. This is divine intervention, so unmistakable that even the most hardened skeptic will know they have witnessed the hand of God. The scroll of Ezekiel 38 is not ancient history. It is tomorrow's headline, written in advance. Every alliance forming in today's Middle East, every threat emanating from Tehran, every piece moving on the geopolitical chessboard, it's all confirmation that we are living inside the prophet's vision. When you watch the news and see Iran's growing boldness, remember, you are not witnessing chaos. You are watching choreography. Divine choreography, where even God's enemies serve his ultimate purpose. But when the armies come like a flood, a fire will answer from heaven. The earth shakes, the skies split, and God no longer whispers, he roars. Picture this moment. The armies of the world have converged. Russia from the north, Turkey from the northwest, Iran, ancient Persia, leading a coalition that stretches across continents. They descend upon Israel like a storm cloud, darkening the horizon with their intent. The nations hold their breath. CNN cameras roll. The world watches what appears to be the final chapter of the Jewish story. But they have forgotten something. They have forgotten who wrote this script. In Ezekiel 39, we witness not just a battle, we witness a revelation. Because when the coalition strikes, when Persia's missiles arc through the sky, when the world expects to see Israel's end, God stands up from his throne. And when the Almighty rises, Creation itself becomes his weapon. The earth convulses beneath the feet of the invaders. Mountains tremble. The very ground rebels against those who dare touch the apple of his eye. Zechariah 2-8 isn't poetry. It's a promise carved in stone. And in that moment, every soldier, every general, every leader who thought they could erase God's covenant people discovers they are not fighting Israel. They are fighting him. Fire falls from heaven, not metaphorical fire, not symbolic judgment, literal flames that consume armies and melt weapons. The confusion that follows is supernatural. Brother turns against brother, ally against ally. The very coalition that united in hatred dissolves in chaos as God's hand moves across the battlefield like a divine conductor orchestrating their defeat. But this isn't just about military victory. This is about vindication. So will I make my holy name known in the midst of my people Israel, declares the Lord in Ezekiel 39-7. For too long the nations have mocked. For too long they have questioned whether the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob still watches over his people. This moment answers every doubt with thunder. Iran, the same Persia that once carried God's people home from exile, now lies broken in the dust, struck down not by Israeli intelligence or American missiles, but by the very hand that once anointed Cyrus. The irony is staggering. The nation that God used as his instrument of mercy becomes the instrument through which he displays his justice. And in that moment, watching from your living room, seeing the supernatural unfold on your television screen, you will face the question that echoes through eternity. When God defends his covenant, will you be found standing beneath his name or hiding behind nations? Because this isn't just ancient prophecy. This is tomorrow's headline written in yesterday's ink. When you see the alliances forming, when you hear the threats escalating, when Iran's leaders declare their intent to wipe Israel from the map, remember this chapter. Remember that the author of history has already written the ending. The victory belongs to the Lord. The glory belongs to his name. And those who trust in horses and chariots will discover that there is no weapon formed against Israel that shall prosper. But even after fire falls, prophecy does not end in ash. It speaks of mercy. He once used Persia to build his house. Could he do it again? In the shadow of judgment, something extraordinary happens. Something the world has forgotten, yet heaven remembers with crystal clarity. Deep within the scroll of Jeremiah, past the thundering pronouncements of wrath, past the declarations of divine justice, lies a promise so stunning it defies human logic. A mercy so profound, it rewrites the ending of Iran's story. Listen to these words, spoken by the mouth of the Almighty. But it shall come to pass in the latter days that I will bring again the captivity of Elam, saith the Lord. Jeremiah 49-39. Elam, the ancient heart of what we now call Iran. After the fire of judgment, after the breaking of the bow, after the scattering to the four winds, restoration. What kind of God writes mercy into the margins of judgment? What divine mind weaves redemption into the very fabric of wrath? The same God who once called a pagan Persian king my anointed is the God who promises to set his throne in Elam. Not just visitation, habitation, not just presence, rule. Imagine the scene. In the ruins of pride, altars rise. In the ashes of rebellion, worship ascends. The land that once threatened to destroy God's people becomes the place where his throne is established. This is not mere poetic language. This is prophetic promise, written in the eternal ink of divine intention. But here's what will shake you. This restoration isn't just about Iran. It's about the mystery of how God transforms his enemies into his evangelists. How he turns persecutors into preachers, opposers into worshipers. Remember Saul on the Damascus road? The pattern was set long before Paul ever drew breath. Today, beneath the headlines of hostility, beneath the rhetoric of hatred, something supernatural stirs. In the underground churches of Iran, in the secret gatherings of believers, in the hearts of those who have turned from Islam to Christ, we see the first tremors of Jeremiah's prophecy. The most zealous converts often come from the ranks of the most zealous opponents. What if the missiles being built today are preparing the ground for the altars of tomorrow? What if the very intensity of opposition is proportional to the magnitude of the coming transformation? What if the enemy of today is indeed the evangelist of tomorrow? Consider this divine irony. Iran, which now chants death to Israel, may one day lead pilgrimages to Jerusalem. The nation that seeks to wipe God's people from the map may become a pathway for nations to find their way to Zion. The lips that now blaspheme may one day declare, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." This is not wishful thinking. This is prophetic destiny. From Cyrus to the coming restoration, God has never finished using Persia for his purposes. The same divine hand that once moved a pagan king to rebuild the temple can move a nation to rebuild broken altars of worship. And you, witnessing this age, are seeing the setup for the greatest plot twist in Middle Eastern history. Not just the judgment of Iran, but its redemption. Not just the defeat of an enemy, but the birth of an ally. The God who writes straight with crooked lines is preparing to turn Tehran into a testimony. In every war written by heaven, mercy always leaves a trail of firelight for those who turn. The headlines shout missiles, but prophecy hears echoes. Turn off the news for a moment. Close your eyes. Listen deeper. Beneath the thunder of modern warfare, beneath the rhetoric of nuclear threats and proxy armies, there's an ancient heartbeat, a rhythm that began long before CNN existed, long before the Islamic Republic was born, long before Israel became a nation again in 1948. This is the sound of an ancient war, still breathing. When Iran's supreme leader stands before crowds chanting death to Israel, he doesn't realize he's reading from a script written 2,500 years ago. When Hezbollah rockets rain down from Lebanon, when Hamas tunnels snake beneath Gaza, when Iranian Revolutionary Guards plot in Damascus, they think they're writing history, but they're only fulfilling it. You see, this isn't the first time Persia has threatened to wipe God's people from the face of the earth. In the court of King Xerxes, a man named Haman cast lots to choose the day of Jewish annihilation, the 13th day of the 12th month. He built gallows 50 cubits high for Mordecai. He convinced the king to seal the death decree with his royal ring. The order went out to every province: destroy, kill, and annihilate all Jews, young and old, women and children, in one day. Sound familiar? But God had placed a Jewish woman in the palace, hidden, prepared, positioned for such a time as this. Queen Esther rose from her throne, broke protocol, and entered the king's presence, uninvited. Her people's survival hung on a single moment of royal favor, and when she spoke, the tables turned. Haman swung from his own gallows. The hunters became the hunted. The destroyers were destroyed. The spirit of Haman never died. It merely waited. It hibernated through centuries of exile, through the rise and fall of empires, through the long silence between the testaments. And when Islam swept across Persia in the 7th century, that ancient hatred found new breath, new words, new weapons, but the same murderous intent. Today, Iran doesn't just threaten Israel with words. It encircles her with a ring of fire. Hezbollah to the north, 150,000 rockets pointed at Israeli cities. Hamas to the south, tunnels and terror, funded by Tehran. Syrian militias to the east, Iranian proxies armed and ready, Houthis in Yemen, missiles that can reach Jerusalem. The noose is tightening, just as Haman planned. But here's what Iran's leaders have forgotten, what Hamas doesn't understand, what every enemy of Israel throughout history has failed to grasp. The God who saved his people in Persia still watches from his throne. The promise spoken to Abraham still echoes through time. I will bless those who bless you. and curse those who curse you. Do you see politics? Or do you see prophecy fulfilled in real time? Every alliance Iran forges, every weapon it builds, every threat it makes, it's all been seen before. Ezekiel watched it in a vision. Daniel interpreted it in a dream. The nations will gather. The armies will march. The hatred will reach its crescendo. But the end is already written. The gallows Haman built became his own execution. The Red Sea that trapped Israel became Pharaoh's grave. The fiery furnace meant to consume God's servants became their testimony. And the war that Iran believes will destroy Israel will become the stage for God's greatest revelation. And when all nations gather, one king will rise not from Tehran or Washington, but from Zion. Conclusion. And so the scroll closes, but not on the story, only on the chapter we've witnessed. Here, in the quiet after revelation, we find ourselves standing at the crossroads of time itself. Behind us stretches the ancient path from the moment Noah's grandson Madai first breathed Persian air, to Cyrus signing decrees with hands anointed by prophecy, to Esther risking everything for a people marked for death. Ahead of us lies the thunder of Ezekiel's vision, armies gathering like storm clouds, nations marching toward their divine appointment with destiny. But what have we truly seen in this journey through the centuries? We've watched Persia wear many faces. The deliverer who freed captives from Babylon, the protector who shielded Jews from genocide, the empire that rebuilt God's temple with foreign gold. And now, the adversary whose leaders curse Israel's name on international stages, whose proxies rain terror from every border, whose nuclear ambitions cast shadows across the world. How does a nation travel such a distance from God's anointed instrument to his prophesied opponent? How does the same soil that once produced liberation now cultivate hatred? Perhaps the answer lies not in politics, but in the deeper mystery of divine sovereignty. Perhaps Persia's story reveals something profound about how God writes history, using the willing and the unwilling, the faithful and the rebellious, the grateful and the defiant, all serving his purpose, all fulfilling his plan, even in their opposition. Could it be that Iran's current hostility toward Israel is not the final word, but the necessary darkness before an unprecedented dawn? Could it be that the nation which once delivered God's people from captivity will one day need deliverance itself? Think about it. When Cyrus conquered Babylon, he didn't know he was fulfilling Isaiah's prophecy. When Esther entered the king's chamber, she didn't know she was acting out a divine script. When Daniel interpreted visions of ram and goat, he couldn't have imagined that his words would echo in tomorrow's headlines. And when Iranian leaders gather their allies today, do they realize they're assembling exactly as Ezekiel foretold? Do they understand that their march toward Israel may be the very thing that reveals God's glory to a watching world? You see, prophecy is not a weapon of fear, it's a map of hope. It tells us that no matter how dark the storm, no matter how fierce the opposition, no matter how